Chapter 18, Section 3, New Successes and Challenges. What were the successes and challenges faced by the Civil Rights Movement after 1964? So after we get that Civil Rights Act, what's going on? So we'll look at the significance of Freedom Summer, the March on Selma, the violence that can erupt in some American cities all across the United States, compare the goals and methods of African American leaders. We're going to see kind of a split in the Civil Rights Movement, and then the social and economic situation of African Americans by about 1975. So by the mid 1970s, what things are going on here in the United States for African Americans. So when you look at Freedom Summer, SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, is going to stage what they call Freedom Summer. And Freedom Summer is all about registering African Americans to vote. So the Civil Rights Act, remember, didn't really address voting. And so it's going to be the focus of the Civil Rights Movement from this point forward is getting people, African Americans, the right to vote. So there's a couple of different things that happen that are going to illustrate how difficult this is really going to kind of be. One is 3 civil rights workers from the North, 2 of them white, 1 of them African American, are going down south. They're going to lead a freedom school where they're going to help people teach African Americans how to register to vote and how to get out and get other people registered to vote. Well, the KKK finds out that they're down there. They're stopped by a police officer who is part of the KKK. He arrests them, takes them in, notifies the Klan that he will be releasing them at 10 p.m. The students get into their car, they drive away, stopped by the Klan. They're beaten, they're tortured, they're shot at point blank range, and then their bodies are buried in an earthen dam. And the rest of the summer of 1964, the FBI is looking for these individuals. They eventually find them. Another thing that happens is at the Democratic National Convention. In the South, the Democrat Party is almost exclusively white. But what you see emerging is, especially in Mississippi, the Freedom Democratic Party is starting, so that it's an alternative to this all-white Democrat Party. They want to have their members seated at the Democratic Convention. The Democratic Party ends up striking some kind of a deal where they would seat a couple of the members, but not all of them. The actual Mississippi Democratic Party storms out in protest of this. But the most important thing is Fannie Lou Hamer's testimony during this period of time. It was supposed to be nationally televised. However, it ends up that Lyndon Johnson breaks in and disrupts this testimony because it is so damaging to the Democrat Party, but also to the United States. What African Americans go through in an attempt to get the right to vote. So this is going to be a fight that's going to continue. Again, targeting a place that is known for its racism. The Civil Rights Movement is going to target Selma, Alabama, because they also have a police commissioner who is brutal. They also are preventing people from having the right to vote. They are going to march from one part of they're going to march from Montgomery to Selma to push for voting rights. In order to do that, they have to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and it's at the Edmund Pettus Bridge where they are met with brutal police force to try and prevent them. And this gets known as Bloody Sunday. It gets broadcast all over the United States, and the nation becomes outraged because you have, again, these African American civil rights, nonviolent, not armed, going across the bridge, and that simple act of defiance by the African American community gets total retaliation from the police force, and they use billy clubs and tear gas. And so as Americans are watching this, they're shocked and outraged. This spurs Lyndon Johnson to give a speech that basically says, this is not an African American issue, this is an American issue. An injustice anywhere is an injustice everywhere, and that it is time for African Americans to have the right to vote. So that is going to get the Civil Rights or the Voting Rights Act of 1965 passed, and this is going to give the government some pretty powerful tools to enforce it. It bans literacy tests, if you remember taking that way back when. The other thing is the federal government is going to come in and oversee the registration of voters and also the election. So they're going to take it out of the state's hands because the states have proven that they're unable, incapable, or unwilling to allow African Americans to vote. And you can see the impact of this in the number of African Americans who are registered. The red lines were in 1960. The blue lines are in 1966. So in some of these places, especially the ones that we've been talking about, Mississippi, Alabama, you see very dramatic changes in how many people are registered to vote. And then you can see that also. And then they're also going to pass the 24th Amendment, which bans poll taxes, which had been used to keep poor African Americans from voting. Now, despite all of these changes, what you see in 1965 and 1967 is racial violence all across the country. Now, there's multiple factors involved here, but one of the things, if you look at that map, you can see in 1967 that there was a race riot even in Waterloo, Iowa. And Waterloo, Iowa is to this day considered to be one of the worst places in Iowa to live if you're African American, in terms of being denied opportunities and being kind of stuck in a situation where it's very difficult to get out of. But these are reacting to the fact that even though they have the Voting Rights Act, they still have trouble being able to vote freely. They still have other issues that are going on. And on top of that, we're starting to have a growing backlash of the Vietnam War. Now, that's really going to kind of pick up in 1966, 67, but still there's multiple things going on here that are causing this unrest. So in response to these riots, Lyndon Johnson has the Kerner Commission, and they're investigating the cause of these things. And what they really find are all of those things that are listed there, but primarily what they found is that African Americans are frustrated by how long it has taken to make any kind of change, and that this is progressing at a snail's pace. So this pervasive discrimination and segregation has just reached a boiling point. They feel like, finally in 1954 we have Brown versus Board of Education. Things are finally going to change, and then they don't. And then 1964, they get the Civil Rights Act, and they think, finally, things are going to change, and then they don't. And then 1965, they think things are going to dramatically change, and yeah, they get to register to vote, and they get to vote, but they find that that doesn't lead to dramatic change. And so all of that frustration is kind of building up. And the other thing the Kerner Commission says is that African Americans live in a situation that the vast majority of Americans just simply cannot understand. And so that is what is causing all of this frustration and riots. On top of all of that, the other thing you start to see is a new set of voices are emerging in the civil rights movement. Malcolm X is probably the starkest contrast to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., at least initially. He begins to argue actually for the separation of races. And he also says that, you know what, if you get hit, you should hit back. And these are very different messages. He says we're nonviolent with people who are nonviolent with us. But if you're violent with us, we're going to stand up. We're going to protect ourselves. We're not going to curl up in a ball anymore. And that message is terrifying to most of America. And then when you get some other things happening, white America starts to really get nervous about what's going on. Stokely Carmichael promotes what he calls black power. Now, in his mind, what black power means is that African Americans need to use their dollars and their vote to send clear messages to the white community, that they need to, as an African American group, do business with businesses that are sympathetic to the African American cause, businesses that are going to help promote African Americans. So you spend money in those businesses. You vote for candidates that are going to bring real change to the African American community, and that's what he meant by Black Power. However, it seems like when you throw this in with the fact that there's violence going on, the rest of America interprets Black Power to mean violence. Some of the other things too is you get some of these young African American leaders who get arrested over and over and over again, and they finally say, we're not going to get arrested anymore. We're tired of this process. And then in the 1968 Olympic Games, you've got two African American sprinters who win the gold and the bronze in the 200-meter dash. And in a sign of solidarity, they raise this black gloved fist, and they end up getting their medals stripped from them by the Olympic Committee, the American Olympic Committee. The other thing that's going to be happening here is young African Americans are going to begin to take charge of things on their own. So the Black Panthers Forum, what they're going to do is they're going to take over, or at least in their minds, they're going to patrol their own neighborhoods. They're going to launch anti-poverty campaigns within their own neighborhoods. They're going to support this Black Pride movement. But they get to be seen as very militant because they march to Sacramento, California, the capital, dressed like this, armed with shotguns, to demonstrate their right to be able to bear arms like any other American. However, that's seen as being too aggressive, too assertive, and a little bit too violent for most of Americans. And so the Black Panthers end up being a kind of a symbol of young, aggressive action. For Dr. Martin Luther King, he is going to move away from, not necessarily move away from civil rights, but what he's going to begin to focus on is economic equality, not just for African Americans, but for all Americans. And so he goes down to support the sanitation workers' strike. And in the process of doing that, he gives a speech and almost kind of prophesizing what's going to happen the next day about how I've been to the mountaintop. And the next day, he is shot and killed outside of his balcony. At the time, Robert Kennedy is running for president, and he breaks through in one of his campaign stops to announce to the nation that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. had died and that we need to continue to do more for African American rights. And within a couple of months, I believe it was June, he is struck down by an assassin's bullet as well. So when we look at what's the state of African Americans in 1975-ish, civil rights had advanced. You have the end to de jure segregation. You have the beginning of desegregation of schools. You have the ability for African Americans to register and to vote and to participate. You do see poverty rates going down, median incomes going up. You see dramatic increases in the graduation rates of African Americans. You get the first African American Supreme Court Justice in Thurgood Marshall. So things seem to be going in the right direction. And they are going in the right direction. They're getting better. The problem is there's still controversial issues that kind of stick around. Lack of economic opportunities. Whenever there's a recession, the African American community is hit harder than the rest of America. Desegregation attempts with forced busing are highly controversial. Nixon administration is going to put in a policy of affirmative action, meaning that schools and businesses need to hire a certain number of minorities, and that is seen as reverse discrimination. And then when we look at more recently the Voting Rights Act, the Supreme Court has started to strike down some of the key provisions of that and is turning more of those voting back over to these southern states. And what we've started to see is these southern states have begun to again limit the ability of African Americans, and I'm not talking 1960s levels, but they are starting to limit the opportunities or making it more difficult for minority groups to be able to vote in those southern states. The other thing is when we start looking at this from the perspective of how does this affect other Americans, Hank Aaron talks about how when he was approaching Babe Ruth's home run record, he started to receive death threats. And actually, he had to stay alone under armed guard from the rest of the team because there were people who were trying to kill him because he was going to break a white man's home run record. And even to this day, this is Senator Rick Scott and Representative Trey Gowdy. They're both from South Carolina, and they have had an interesting interview a year or two ago about what they've learned from each other and their experiences, but more importantly, Trey Gowdy and what he learned from the African American Tim Scott about what it's like to be an African American in the United States today and how that has opened his eyes to how we need to better understand each other in this country.